What's up guys, it's that Panda Guy and I'm here again with another video, and today we're going to be looking at G1, but we're not going to be talking about exactly what happened. We're going to be talking about a whole different topic, and one of the reasons is I just found this footage to be a little bit more boring. There were a lot more tower fights and stuff, and I was like, it's a little bit harder to commentate over stuff like this, and I still wanted to show you guys this footage, but I wanted to talk a bit about something that I found interesting and I thought would be an interesting topic to kind of talk about. And I have some stuff like this that I sometimes want to talk about. It's just there's not really a good time or place to do it, or if I want to do it, it's kind of like, oh, do I just stare at my base for 10 minutes and I could just commentate over this footage and tell you guys about what I think. Either way, that was long enough for an intro. Let's kind of hop right into it. So I wanted to talk a bit about why I think G1 is overrated, sort of, or it's the best but worst bracket. You know what I mean? I think that these are always, and when I say G1, I'm also talking about G1, G2, G3 sometimes, right? These brackets can be insane, but it's like, for an outsider, it's always interesting looking in, don't get me wrong. And even as an insider who's playing on the inside, it can be really fun. And there is an aspect to G1 or G2 or like these insane whale fights that you'll not be able to get anywhere else. But I do think that there's kind of a redundancy to these. I also think that it's just like it's so whale based that it becomes, it always feels like it's just, okay, who has the bigger wallet? Let's freaking fight with our wallets. And, if you're a normal T6 player, or you're not even a T6 player, you have no place in the field, nothing like that, right? Another thing is, I would say that although there is strategy, I definitely think there's strategy involved in a bracket like G1 or G2. I think it's always the same thing, right? You never see any difference really in how it's kind of handled. Usually it's just build up to mid as fast as possible, block these guys off, etc. Not to mention that you don't even have zone 1 fights in the beginning. It's always running riders across the map to kind of node knock or mess with your enemy for the full duration of the fights, and maybe at best you'll see some fights over cement, right? It's just so boring with G1 because unlike normal brackets, right, like let's say you're in G10, let's say you're in G20, there's a lot more balance there. I think there's a lot more alliances that can kind of compete and hold their head over the water. And unless you have, I would say, a variable, right? Whereas there's maybe some random really big whale, you're not going to see like a bracket unbalanced. You're not going to see it to the point where people can't build into whatever the zone they really choose to. And you see in a lot of these like brackets much lower than G1 through 3 or something, you'll see people building into the left zone or the right zone, and they'll kind of clash within the first zone. Whereas in G1, that's almost never going to happen because everybody fights up mid. And you know why that is? Because the top and bottom legions, right? Azure and Crimson, they have absolutely no capable way of possibly pushing against, a group like ROK or a group like HMB or a group like Boone, because they always have these two groups on this top or bottom, much vastly weaker than the groups on the left or right. And although this might seem like a small detail, I think it just kind of goes to show like it's always the same thing when you're fighting in these whale brackets. Not to mention, like I said, it's just always an ego fight. Who has the better ding dong? Who has the bigger wallet, right? And like I said, you just never have that first zone fight, and it's just super boring, super dragged out. I don't think that this event's totally terrible in general. You get a lot more action in smaller brackets, but this is probably why you saw so many whales complaining. It's like, you sit here for a week to what? Get node knocked? To run around node knocking for a few days, right? Until zone 3, whatever, the freaking middle zone finally opens, right? Whereas you only have a fight for a few hours. And this is one reason Island Raid was as interesting as it was, because you could start the fights right away. Not to mention that these fights would typically drag out for days, whereas you have 2 days to settle the stuff, and you have legions, right? So you have all these other alliances in your legion, which also complicate things. And although this isn't like, this isn't specifically only for G1, obviously, because a lot of brackets have to deal with this issue, I think it's even more prevalent in such a big bracket like G1, right? All it takes is having one alliance that can run rallies, one mega whale player in your legion, and you can run double rallies, making your trades vastly better. And it just becomes kind of pointless for one of the legions to show up fighting. Or it can be one legion that has, a mega whale on their team, whilst the other legion might not have anybody. Like take G2, our last G2, for example. Whereas Azure, they had MK and stuff, right? Their tower fights would be much better on trades. They could run many more rallies because their tower trades were just that good. They were able to do that. Whereas if you were on Crimson, you were just incapable of field fighting. You were incapable of running rallies or defending a tower that would trade remotely positive. And for these two legions that I mentioned, I imagine that normally they would rather not fight, right? But it's kind of like an obligation, and and you feel I feel like it's kind of like pressured, right? Like if you don't fight, you look like a weakling, or you look like you're not doing your part, or just in general, you might get shamed for that, and it's kind of sucky, but it just is how it is, and it's very unfortunate, honestly, because it's just like, at that point, you're coming in here to be a sandbag, and not a good sandbag at that. The morale is low, you don't want to be, and it always happens. Whereas like Azure and Crimson always get beat on, and then these legions, right? They'll get put into submission and they'll get sent back usually. And then by the time that happens, then the two legions end up clashing, right? After one of these legions just get totally smacked down, or both of the legions get totally smacked down, they trade terrible, and they just do their best to drain the enemy as much as possible. It's just like it's really sad, and it makes these brackets really unenjoyable. Let me tell you guys, if I end up in G1 and I'm not on like Boone, HMB, DHX, whatever, right? Like let's say I'm not on one of those legions, I would not compete. I just would not compete. Realistically, I know I say that, but honestly, I probably would show up. It just really depends on, my legion. If I'm confident in winning, how good I think the trades will realistically be on towers, if we have any whales, if they're online, how much that'll depend a lot on how much I fight. But I'm not going to fight a pointless battle. I'm not going to have my alliance members filling a tower that I know they're going to trade like 1 to 10 on, for example, right? Or it's going to get sworn to oblivion. It's just not something I'm really interested in. I'm not really interested in getting my members to port up to mid, knowing that they're 100% going to get zeroed, right? It just isn't a smart play, and I don't know, man. Like maybe I'm complaining a bit too much. I just think that G1 is a bit unsufferable. And honestly, it's even harder to say if this is better or worse than Island Raid G1 wise, right? Like these legions are at the very least capable of building up mid, doing some sort of field work, right? Compared to G1, where in G1 and Island Raid or something, right? Imagine these teams had to fight by themselves, right? These alliances were on their own. These alliances get absolutely crushed. They're not able to fill towers fully. They're not able to run rallies. They're not able to field control at all because they don't have multiple alliances they can kind of coordinate with. It's just really miserable. I think there's obviously, like I said, a really cool aspect of G1. It's always interesting to watch, always interesting to see how things turn out, always interesting to see how the whales kind of fare. But when it comes down to it, it's just kind of like an ego fight between whales. And I don't think that, like, I think there's just very little interest, at least on my end, right? When it kind of comes to these things, sometimes I just think it also becomes redundant when it's the same thing over and over. You got to imagine, right? And I felt this personally. Take Island Raid, for instance, right? The first few months or however many months, right? The only good fights, I would say, or the biggest fights, not only good fights, because there were good fights in lower brackets, but the only big whale fights, for example, if you were in Boone or you were in HMB, you would either fight Boone. You would actually, yeah, it was just Boone and HMB. Either you would fight each other or you would fight almost nobody at all, because usually they would pair them together. They would pair us together, and we would have one really good island, and the next island they would kind of throw us in a random bracket, so one or the other, both of us could be satisfied, I guess, maybe win a easy bracket, whatever the case. Then they would throw us back together, and it's kind of boring when you kind of have the same enemy every single time. It's the same people, it's the same everything, right? It just kind of gets a little boring. I mean, I can still have fun giving the fights, but it's like, give me someone different, give me different strategies, something, right? Now, that's another thing I wanted to touch on. I just think there's a lot less strategy that kind of goes into a bracket like G1. And I don't know if I mentioned that already. I probably talked about that, but not to mention just in general, building into the left or right zone and being able to clash in those zones. It's also, like I said, just there is a lot less strategy. You know what I mean? It's whales versus whales, and whoever has more whales can control the field. Whoever has more whales can just totally crush the field. Whoever has more whales, blah 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 blah. It's the same thing, right? You can't if you don't have enough whales, or they don't spend enough money, they can't keep field controlling. They can't keep battling towers or anything. And you got to also think of it from the perspective of a T5 player or a normal T6 player, right? There's almost no place for you on the field, even if you are T6, right? It's just I feel like it's just so redundant. And like I said, it's a whale fight, right? It's just wallets versus wallets at that point. And as a T5 player, you clearly have no place on this field unless you want to get absolutely destroyed. And that kind of just leaves you to filling rallies, filling towers. And at that point, it's like, what is the point of me being here? You know what I mean? I'm simply here to fill rallies or fill towers. And that kind of just is is boring in a way, right? It just feels like all you're doing is living as a filler. And I'm not saying nothing's wrong with that. I'm sure some players who are T5 or whatever don't actually care and they just like this kind of lifestyle, right? But I personally think, right, like if I were still a T5 player or something, I would just have a lot less fun only being able to fill towers. Whereas if I was in G5, maybe I'd be able to help on the field. Or if I was in G10, maybe I could help a little bit more in the field. Or I could run a rider march around without having a 55%, speed bonus from someone's freaking armaments being jacked to hell and them just running you down, even though you're a T4, T5 versus a T6, which T6 are naturally slower, but these guys are freaking jacked to hell. Just in general, I just think that there's a lot of flaws with, fighting in G1. Like I said, I still think that there's an interesting aspect there. I just think that there's not a lot to be lost out on, even if you're in a smaller bracket, right? I definitely wouldn't have experienced as much adrenaline rushes as I have if I hadn't fought in as many G1 battles as I have. I wouldn't have enjoyed, these crazy fights. But then again, I've also had really enjoyable fights in smaller brackets, and in some cases more enjoyable than I ever have had in like G1. Like I said, I just wanted to do a video talking about this. I thought it was an interesting topic. You guys tell me your thoughts though. I will see you guys in the next video. And yeah, that is it. Peace out.